Welcome to There Is a Method to the Madness. My name is Rob Maxwell. I'm an exercise physiologist and personal trainer. I'm the owner of Maxwell's fitness programs. I've been in business since 1994. This morning I'm going to talk about how to properly fuel as a teenager for sporting events, athletic events, and specifically in this case it is crew, because a fan of the show, Nicole from Orlando, messaged me and asked me if I would talk about that, how to properly fuel for essentially an underweight teenager. I wouldn't say like underweight as in bad, but just a kid that needs to actually gain some weight and needs to be properly fueled for competition. And I told her I would cover that because that is a very good question, and it happens a lot. It happens a lot. So it's important to get into. Before I get into that, let me thank our sponsors, Jonathan and Lynn Gilden of the Gilden Group at Realty Pros. They currently have over 280 five-star reviews on Zillow. They handle both commercial and personal property, and they love the Ormond Beach area. That is their expertise, but they handle all of Volusia County. So give them a shout if you need any help. They can be reached at thegildengroup.com. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to properly fuel for a teenager, a late teenager, because it's a little bit different than, say, preteens or early teen, mid-teens, so like 13, 14, 15, I guess I would call mid-teens, and then 16, 17, 18, you're kind of getting into young adults almost, especially for the kids that play sports. A lot of them are already, I'd say seasoned nowadays because kids have been playing sports for so long and structured. So it's a little bit different. But so I'm going to cover, say, the late teens, which would cover, say, from like 16, 17 up until 19, and really even 20. So there is a difference when you're talking different kinds of sports, because when you get into aerobic versus anaerobic sports, there's definitely different fueling needs. So in this case, it's more of an aerobic / anaerobic sport when we're talking crew. It's not like football that's pure anaerobic. And if you remembered from my podcast the other day when I was talking about how do we really grow muscles, I was talking about time frames of the energy systems and how we produce more ATP for fuel. So pure anaerobic is quick bursts of speed with lots of recovery. All right. I understand that lots of recovery is relative to each individual, but it's really not. In other words, somebody might be extremely gassed after a run up the middle in football that might have took them 7 seconds, but it was such an explosive effort that afterwards they're pretty gassed if they're asked to do it again after the huddle in about 30 seconds. I get it, but that is still very different from a sport like crew where it is continuous depending on how long the race is. But even the shorter races, it's still a continuous motion where we're getting up into the minutes instead of seconds. So those types of sports require more detail to your fueling, because in those sports, we're using both carbohydrates and fat for substrates. Now, in the case of football and basketball and baseball, which are very anaerobic sports, we're using only carbohydrates for fuel and not necessarily fat. Not that that matters a whole lot as far as the macronutrients you eat, but it does matter in the sense of how many stored carbohydrates do you have. So it just, to make a long story short on that, I don't want to get out into the weeds on that. I want you to understand that when you're dealing with more endurance type athletics, such as crew, cross country, swim team, things like that, that your kids, if they're listening, you are doing, it's going to take more detail to your fuel, because you have to rely upon not only the immediate influx of carbohydrates being used for fuel, like if you have a little bit of a Gatorade, or, I don't like Gatorade, but something more of a sports drink that's diluted down to about 8% carbohydrate, which is the way it should be, instead of 100% carbohydrate, because the 100% carbohydrate, your stomach's not going to be able to break down and utilize. It'll just make you feel bloated and sick. So it's better to go with more of a real sports drink made by sports performance people, and most likely something you can't get off of the soda aisle at Publix or Target. That's a pretty good indicator what's a real sports drink and what's not. So for crew, cross-country swimming, things like that, you're not going to be able to just utilize sports drinks, because the activity is longer and it's recurrent. So crew's interesting because there could be multiple races in a day, things like that. And the same thing with like swim teams or swimming events that are longer than, say, 100 meters. So if you are a person that does like the 500 meter or 1,000 or 1,500 or whatever, that gets into aerobic territory. Even though you think it's not long, that gets into aerobic territory. But then again, you have to maybe go back and do another event. And the same could potentially be true for crew. The same could be said for some track events, not necessarily cross country. But cross country, you are definitely going longer. So to answer Nicole's question, this athlete has to be properly fueled. And when you add to it that they could gain some weight, whether we say underweight or not, could gain some weight, or weight is not an issue, then they even more so have to properly fuel, because fat, as I think everybody knows, but I think oftentimes we forget, we have stored fat to be used for fuel. That's why we store fat. That's why our body stores fat. Now, in the very olden days, long before, say, refrigerators and Wawas and Publix and all these great kind of things, the body did not know if it was going to get its meal. So the reason for stored adipose tissue, subcutaneous fat, is literally to be used for long-term fuel sources. When we're at rest, that's what our body uses for fuel. The fat is broken down to produce more ATP. When we're in motion, we're using both carbs and fat for fuel. The more intense the motion, the more carbohydrate we're using. But carbohydrate and fat are the only energy macronutrients. Protein is not used for energy unless it is an extreme emergency type situation. And that is actually called gluconeogenesis, which essentially means making new energy out of energy that is already there. And in this case, it's the muscle tissue. So that's not a good thing. So ultimately, we use carbohydrates and fat for fuel. So if you are slightly lean or very lean, and as a parent might say, could stand to use a few pounds, that means you don't have a lot of stored adipose. And if you don't have a lot of stored adipose, that also could be reflective of the fact that maybe, just maybe, there's genetic things, there's hormonal things, there's a lot of different issues involved, and I don't want to generalize in this case, but potentially not eating enough good food on a regular basis. So in that case, the person's going to have to make sure that they're properly fueled to an even greater extent than somebody who would, say, be of average weight. Because again, that person might not be being as detailed throughout the day. They get their energy, so they have to do more, say, catch-up work the night before and the morning of to make sure they're adequately fueled. Now, carbohydrates or fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. So that means if we don't have enough carbohydrates present in our system, we can't burn fat. So for the young athlete that wants to perform well in endurance style activities, or really even anaerobic activities like football, baseball, basketball, volleyball, and I would put soccer more in the camp of the swimming and crew, which is what I've been speaking of, then, we need to make sure that we have enough carbohydrates so we can actually get down and burn the fat. All right. So when I said not eating enough good food, we have to pay attention to that. Kids and teens should never be on a diet. All right. Not a diet as in anybody thinks of the word diet. Kids should never be on a diet. I'll repeat that again. If a parent, and I know this is the total opposite case of a kid that is potentially of good body weight or a little low, and so this doesn't apply at all, but I just always have to say this. Like, let's say a kid is a little bit overweight, a teenager is a little bit overweight, whether their own analysis of this or a parent's analysis of this, a kid should never be on a diet. You are setting them up for a lifetime of potential eating disorders and body dysmorphia. So it's never a good idea to do that. We should always encourage exercise. We should always encourage healthy eating. And most importantly, we should just be the best role model we can be for that kid. You don't know how many times I've had parents tell me that their kid needs to lose some weight, and the parent is overweight, and the parent eats junk food in front of them. And I'm thinking, okay, this is as, hypocritical as we can get right now, but it is extremely common. So kids should never be on diets. All right. Got that out of the way. And that's really the case with kids that are young athletes too. Like if the kid is like basically going all what was his name? Bill Romanowski. I use him as kind of the freak subject of the NFL. And I don't know that he's doing overly well now. I'm not completely sure. I know that he wasn't. I will get back to you on that, but that's neither here nor there. But he was known to be the guy that never ate real foods. Like, he was so interested in his peak performance that essentially he was eating nothing but like protein shakes and protein bars and lab bars and all these kind of things and drinks. And then his real food would be what he would call his supplements. All right. That's an extreme case. I understand. So we don't want our kids to be anywhere close to that. That's just not normal. That's just not having a normal adolescence. That is just weird. Okay. Nothing wrong with having a little bit of an energy bar if that's what they like. And sometimes they can be extremely convenient, like Cliff bars or things like that. That's fine. But ultimately, I recommend just good foods that are going to give you complex carbohydrates, just enough fat, and protein. That's what the staple of the diet should be. Read labels. Don't buy into a lot of the, packaging on the front that might say low glycemic, high glycemic, or whatever the claims might be. Get used to reading the labels. If you can pick up, say, a loaf of bread, a box of pasta, brown rice, anything of the carbohydrate nature, and you turn around and you look at the label and the carbohydrates say like 40 grams per serving, the sugar's extremely low, say like 2 or 3 grams, and the fiber is relatively decent, like 3 or 4, that is a great carbohydrate source. All right. No matter what the label says, look at that. You want your complex carbohydrates to be high in our young athletes with not a lot of sugar, not because we're worried about them getting fat, but because that just simply doesn't do them any good. Sugar is a nutrient that when consumed, it needs to be used immediately. If it's not used immediately, it's stored. So basically that sugar just did that person no good. You want complex carbohydrates the day before practices, the day before events. Those would be things like bread, rices, pastas, beans, things like that. But read the boxes. Get the better breads. Get the breads that are higher in complex carbohydrates. Now, bread is typically low sugar, so you don't have to worry about that, but a little bit higher in fiber. Now, this is the days before. The morning of, it's a little bit different. We want to kind of King's X that old fiber there. But so that's your first step for the young crew athlete. Make sure that they're eating predominantly complex carbohydrates that are low in sugar, pretty high in fiber. All right. Next, fats. Kids need enough fats to help them recover. They absolutely do. You don't need to count grams or anything like that, but just make sure that they're choosing fat sources on a daily basis that are mono or polyunsaturated. Those types of fats come from plants. So the best type of fats for young athletes so they recover, and it's also good for the hormonal system too. If you're on too low of a fat diet, you are going to have hormonal issues such as moodiness, depression, and possibly lack of sleep or too much sleep. So you want to make sure that they are getting enough fat, and that can come from ideally nuts and oils. But if you're a kid in high school, whatever, nuts are great. Just make sure that they have a little bag of almonds in their locker, a thing of peanuts. For the longest time, people were like, oh, don't eat peanuts. They're not real nuts. They're more legumes, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, that's just getting like stupid. Okay. Sure, it's not in the same category of a nut, but it acts like a nut and it works perfectly fine. And most kids love peanuts. Put a thing of unsalted or salted, doesn't really matter in their case, Planters, dry roasted nuts in the locker. Make sure they're munching on them all day, along with their complex carbohydrates of breads. And by the way, the breads can be bagels. They don't have to be boring breads. They can be bagels or whatever. And if the person is underweight, quote, that's great. Eat as much of it as they want. Basically, it's going to come down to just stomach upset. But, the day before, you don't have to worry about that. When I say day before, I mean just on like a daily basis of how they eat. And then finally, they want to get protein. We need enough protein, but we don't need too much protein. Protein is a repair macronutrient, as I already stated. It is not used for energy. Therefore, it's got a limited role. Therefore, its intake needs to be limited. It's there to repair, but you definitely need enough. Choose good, low-fat, either low-fat animal products. Make sure they're organic so it doesn't have all the pesticides and hormones and crap that are pumped into most meats that you get and dairies. Or it can be plant-based, but they need to make sure that they're getting low-fat proteins. When I say low-fat proteins, there's a huge difference between a hamburger, which sure is high in protein, but it's also extremely high in fat, and say non-fat Greek yogurt, again, organic preferably, that is non-fat, zero, and super high in protein. There's a big difference. Eating a lot of fat, saturated fats like that, not mono or polyunsaturated like from nuts, but saturated fats, simply don't do you any good. They're just fat. They're not good for you. They're not even good for you at a young age. Again, don't diet if they like a hamburger or whatever. I'm not saying don't eat it. I'm saying don't go out of your way to eat it. There's a big difference. There's eating for pleasure, which is absolutely a part of our human experience, and eating for fuel, which necessarily isn't a part of our conscious human experience, but we still have to go out of our way to do it. All right. Now, morning of routines. You have to make sure that the glycogen has been topped off, meaning the stored carbohydrates that we store in our muscles, and we store up to 500 grams between our muscles and our liver. That's 2,000 calories. So if we're eating a good complex carbohydrate diet that's done for us, that's great. But we have to make sure that we've topped off our carb sources in the morning. So once we wake up, and let's say we have crew practice nice and early, you're going to want to eat something to top off your fuel sources. That could be something like a bagel with nothing on it. But now we don't necessarily want fiber, because fiber is going to upset our stomach. Now we just want more like a white bread, yes, even white bread that is still low in sugar, which almost all bagels and breads are like that. They only add sugar when you're eating donuts. I'm not saying eat a donut. I'm saying, or a cinnamon bun. I'm not saying eat that. I'm saying just basically a couple slices of rye toast, possibly, because that's pretty low in fiber. You don't want to eat fiber the morning of a workout or a race, because that could upset your stomach. You definitely do not want any protein that morning either, because protein takes 4 hours to digest. So if you have protein at 5:30 and you're out on the water at 7:30, that is not even close to being digested, and you wonder why you have an upset stomach, because you either ate protein or fiber. Finally, Then you're going to want to add your glucose polymers while you're working out, which is essentially a good sports drink. Glucose polymers are the sugars that your body can break down readily during exercise, and you're going to want to make sure that you have a good sports drink with 4 to 8% carbohydrate sugar versus 100% Gatorade. If you're like, don't feel like going to a place to get the specialized sports drink, simply dilute it. Just take a bottle of Gatorade, pour just a little bit into a big water bottle, and fill the rest up with water. And that'll be just enough carbohydrate and electrolytes to keep you going as you go. If you've been properly fueling the whole time, you don't have to worry about it. If you've been doing what you're supposed to do the day before, you don't have to worry about it. If you had your pre-workout little snack like bread, or possibly a Cliff Bar or a Power Bar or something like that, that's fine too, then you don't have to worry about it so much. If you haven't been, then yes, it's like cramming for an exam. It's like, I hope I can get enough of this hydration in me to keep me up, but there's no guarantee. So it's really better to just make sure that we've eaten when we're supposed to. And then afterwards, especially for the slightly underweight teenager, eat. Eat whatever you want. If that's when you like French fries, eat them. Eat, eat, eat. You got to make sure you get your energy up. Your body needs calories. That's critical. You've worked hard. Go ahead and eat. Even if your stomach's a little upset, eat something quick, but then an hour later, make sure you really eat a good meal. All right? So those are the keys. And speaking of keys, had another incident this morning where somebody needed overhead garage door, and they understand that they have such great customer service. They texted me super early, said, hey, I know you know so-and-so. Jeff, why am I saying so-and-so when it's their ad? I know that you know Jeff and Zach Hawk, can you please get me their number? They bailed me out before. I said, absolutely. So they contacted them, and the garage door is now going up, and it's going down like it's supposed to, and that's what you get. And we're talking, what is it now? 10:48. This was just a couple hours ago, and it's already been fixed. I mean, that's the key when you hire people that are local, and you're not trying to get some big company that could care less about you, but you got locally owned people who actually care. So if you need any help, check out Overhead Door of Daytona Beach, and they can be reached at overheaddordaytona.com.